Hello. Welcome, everybody. Oh, I'm still backstage, seems. Okay. Hello, my name is Stefan Seele from Coleago Consulting, and I'm going to talk to you about the 6 gigahertz band in the context of WRC 23 and the prospect of an IMT identification in at least in either all or part of the band, more likely part of the band. So if this presentation is based on a report we have written, and so upfront, if you would like to receive a copy of the report, please send me an email. Of course, these slides are also available on the conference platform. So what I'm going to talk to you about today covers the way the need for spectrum is driven by the requirements of 5G, how we model demand for area traffic density and capacity, and looking specifically at 5 cities, and then also address the role of the 6 gigahertz band outside cities for fixed wireless access, and then look at whether the band is useful for for Wi-Fi or for 5G mobile, which is the option here. And I'm also going to look at sharing for incumbents and then summarize the findings. So the key thing to look at is that the need for spectrum changes dramatically with 5G. In the entire history of cellular, we have assigned roughly in the order of 650, sometimes a little bit more, megahertz to mobile. And now in the next few years, we'll assign far more than that just over a space of 4 years. So that shows how important spectrum has become in the context of 5G. And I look at the 6 gigahertz band, 5925 to 7125 megahertz, as a candidate band for 5G. Now, what's different about 5G? Well, essentially, we can think of 5G as not so much as an evolution, but as a revolution, because things change by a factor rather than by a small percentage. So the requirement for user experience data rate is 10 times what it was with LTE Advanced. It's 100 megabits. And the area traffic capacity in terms of megabits per square meter is, in fact, 5G is supposed to deliver 100 times higher traffic densities. So 5G is then not a continuation of the mobile business as we know it. LTE essentially a best effort service for smartphone users. And as you can see on the slide, 5G is all of that. So yes, it is still mobile broadband, now enhanced mobile broadband, but it is also fixed wireless access, massive machine type combination, and very low latency and very high availability and reliability form of critical machine type communications. So that is very, very different. Now, the spectrum that is already being used in most Latin American countries is shown here on the left, maybe up to 780 megahertz. I know a few countries are behind in signing spectrum, but this is roughly what it is. Some doubt over the 2300 and so on. In some cases, the 700 has not been assigned and so on. But the new so-called 5G bands, although in most cases they're in fact technology neutral, so we're looking at 3.5 gigahertz, and depending on the country, there's 200 to 400 megahertz. In many cases, only 200 due to satellites use. But then there may be 1,200 megahertz available in 6 gigahertz. And those bands, the upper mid-band spectrum, that is necessary to deliver the user experience data rates citywide in high density areas. And on top of that, you need the high bands, also referred to as millimeter wave, and that is to satisfy the area traffic capacity of 10 megabits per square meter. Sometimes the question comes up, can we substitute one bit of spectrum for another? To a certain degree you can, but essentially different types of spectrum serve a different purpose, as shown on this slide. So what we are looking at here is, how do we deliver the citywide speed coverage layer for 5G? And you cannot do that with high band spectrum. You need the upper mid-band spectrum, so 3.3 to 6 gigahertz, that's the range you need. And that gives you your citywide speed coverage layer. So that's a contiguous coverage layer. And then on top of it, you have these hotspots here. For example, a stadium, a shopping center, a very busy intersections where operators would deploy 26 gigahertz or other millimeter wave type spectrum. And of course, you also need the low bands to give you coverage in suburban and rural, as well as deep indoors in urban areas. So originally, the way people modeled demand was simply by looking at data volume, because this is what operators are selling. They're selling bundles of data, X gigabytes for X dollars. But as you can see, 5G is really about delivering a particular data rate or speed. And you can see that transition when you look at countries with a 5G offering that has been around already for now a year. In Korea, what's essentially being sold is speed, so a user experience in terms of speed, and that is driving the demand for spectrum. So the starting point then is the ITU requirement of the user experience data rate of 100 megabits. How do we deliver that? And so with 5G, a key factor in driving the demand is, in fact, that user experience data rate anytime, anywhere, while on the move. Of course, we can never really guarantee a speed, but there is a high expectation or a quasi-guarantee that users will in fact experience that data rate when they need it. And by users, I don't just mean people with smartphones. I mean, in time, of course, we will have all the other things, cameras, connected cars, etc. So why do we need more spectrum? Well, it is all about area traffic density. So what we looked at is we built a model, and our starting point, as I said, the ITU requirement of a user experience data rate. We then looked at population density. The next question, how many people in a particular area are demanding that 100 megabits simultaneously? And by the way, not just people, also other applications. So we have a concurrent demand from human users and new use cases. Of course, some of the traffic will occur in hotspots and it is offloaded to Wi-Fi. That gives us our traffic demand in terms of gigabits per square kilometer. That's the demand side. On the supply side, we have macro and micro side. First of all, the macro sides, we have the sectorization, we have the spectrum that's deployed on the macro side. We make a reasonable assumption for spectral efficiency in terms of bits per hertz. One of the things that will happen with 5G is to deliver area traffic capacity, we won't just rely on additional spectrum, but there will be a large number of small cells. And so we also must take account of that. And spectrum, notably a high mid-band spectrum and upper mid-band spectrum, will be deployed on those cell sites, and there is a different spectral efficiency. This gives us our capacity supply per square kilometer. Now, we're using population density as a proxy because there will be many other uses, but generally speaking, I think we can accept that traffic occurs where people are. So, for example, cameras are where people are, cars are where people are, sensors are where people are, and so on. So this is a reasonable approach to use population density as a proxy. Now, how do we do this? We are not relying on looking at administrative boundaries, which are they're not terribly useful for demand modeling. You have to look at actual population density. And here's an example, looking at Lagos in Nigeria. So we looked at a contour line with a population density of 17,500 to identify the central regions or the very high density areas in Lagos. And we have identified an area of 192.7 square kilometers. So a fairly large area if you think about it. And the population density there is 28,000 people per square kilometer. As I said, we modeled a few other cities. Here's Tokyo, similar approach, slightly lower density. And since we are in Latin America, here's Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo now is slightly different. There's not one coherent or one contiguous high density area, but there's several areas within the Sao Paulo urban extent, which together add up to 266 square kilometers with a population density of 21,542. So you can see in terms of size and so on, they're fairly similar. Paris, an example from Europe, everybody tightly squeezed together in the city center in a single area. We have Moscow, looks a little bit more like Sao Paulo. So the only thing then we have to ask ourselves, what is the concurrent use? In other words, surely not everybody will be using or demanding 100 megabits at the same time. So we use an activity factor. And this activity factor is likely to go over time as we get increased use from human users and also new use cases. Broadly speaking, the higher usage, the more concurrent use there will be. And this is evident when you look at the fixed network. At the fixed network, the dimension is completely different. You have very, very high concurrent use factors. And with 5G, of course, what we have seen, unlimited data plans are becoming common. And this translates into higher activity factor as from human users, as people watch videos and so on. If we look at usage in places like Finland, we're already in excess of a gigabyte a day, and it is growing. So how about offload to millimeter wave? Well, in some high density places indoors, possibly also outdoor, some of the traffic will be offloaded to millimeter wave, but it is impossible to cover a whole city with millimeter wave. The number of sites would be far too large to make it a viable proposition from an economic perspective. And here's a statement from T-Mobile. Millimeter wave spectrum has great potential in terms of speed and capacity, but it doesn't travel far from the cell site and doesn't penetrate materials at all, so windows, foliage. It will never materially scale beyond small pockets of 5G hotspot in dense urban environment. Possibly up to 20% can be uploaded, but we think realistically the offload is probably more in the range of 10 to 15%. Now, how did we model area traffic capacity? I've already shown our approach here. We look at the macro intersite distance and we assume all the spectrum is deployed on all the sites. So this maximizes the use of existing spectrum. We assumed a spectral efficiency relevant to 5G because after all, in time, all of the spectrum will be devoted to 5G. We then added in the small cells, usually small cell sectorization. There is no sectorization, so that's different from the macro site where we assume 3 sectors, and there is less spectrum deployed on a small cell, and the spectral efficiency is different. So here the assumptions, so 3 sectors for macro sites. We have assumed an average intersite distance of 400 meters for macro sites. For small cells, the intersite distance isn't really relevant because there is no contiguous coverage. They're in fact put in where the speed coverage holds. And this is the spectral efficiency we have assumed. And then the amount of spectrum, that is what is likely to be available. And our scenarios then with 6 gigahertz, we said, okay, what if we don't have any 6 gigahertz spectrum for IMT? What if we have 700 megahertz? What if the entire 1.2 gigahertz can be used for IMT? So let's look at these cities where demand and supply meets. So we're comparing traffic demand per square kilometer with the capacity. And we looked at 5 cities. Here's the summary data for these 5 cities, the population density in the urban area. So this is, as I said, not the administrative boundaries. This is the high density area. So the size of the urban centers varies from a high of 266 to just 85 in Paris, and correspondingly, where you have the size of the area is small, you've got the highest population here and very high population density. So it varies from, in our sample, from 19,000 to 28,000. But as you will see, the where it starts to matter is from about 9,000 or so. So at WR23, there is agenda item 1.2, and this is discussing or is being put forward to get an IMT identification globally of 400 megahertz in the band, and then a further 600 is being looked at for ITU region 1, and then outside the IMT process, a further 500 may be used. So that's, countries can decide to do that. But what's agenda item 1.2 really addresses 6425 to 7125, and the Americas region, notably Latin America, because of course the US has already made its decision, could decide to also support an IMT identification for 6425 to 7025 megahertz. So the scenarios we ran depend, or the amount of capacity available depend a little bit on the spectrum available. These are the assumptions we have made for lower midbands and then upper midbands, and then we did these scenarios on top. So this is Lagos. Let me explain this chart. It's a little bit complicated. So we have the population density here on the horizontal axis, and we're locating Lagos with its population density of just over 28,000. So that's the population density. On the vertical axis, we have the traffic capacity in terms of gigabits per square kilometer. That's it here. So that's capacity and demand. The horizontal dotted line indicate the capacity, the lowest one. If we do not have any 6 gigahertz spectrum, that's this one. This one, if we have 700 megahertz, and this if we have the entire 1.2 gigahertz. And the colored upward sloping lines here, these lines, this is the demand lines. So that's area traffic demand, depending, of course, it slopes upwards with population density. The density of demand slopes upwards, but we have modeled different activity factors. Right now, I think the activity factor, it's a little bit hard to get data on that, but indications we had from operators, today's activity factor is somewhere in the neighborhood of 5%. So 5% are using their devices simultaneously in the busy period in cities. But that is increasing. So these are the upper sloping line. And where the lines cross the demand line, at this point here for Lagos, you can read off whether you would need additional spectrum. And as you can see, with a 5% activity factor, we are okay with Lagos without any 6 gigahertz spectrum. But if it goes to 10%, for sure, we need an extra 600. So if it goes to this point, we need an extra 700 megahertz. We need even more if it goes to 15%. And at higher activity factors, well, if we don't get any additional spectrum over and above beyond that, we need to move to extreme cell site densification. Tokyo, lower population density, so we require, in theory, less spectrum. So perhaps for Tokyo, we could say, fine, 700 is sufficient. Sao Paulo, again, the 15% activity factor meets the population density threshold at where we would require an additional 700 megahertz of 6 gigahertz spectrum. Paris, the very high population density, and as you can see, we really do need quite a bit of spectrum in addition to that. Moscow is slightly unfortunate in Moscow because there is very little C-band spectrum available, or none at all, which means that there is a very, very substantial requirement for an IMT identification of the 6 gigahertz band, because there's so little other mid-band spectrum available. And this may also be the case in some Central and Latin American countries, because part of the C-band is and continues to be used by satellite. So far, we talked about the need for spectrum in a high-density environment. But of course, the 6 gigahertz, if 6 gigahertz receives an IMT identification, it can also be used for 5G outside cities to deliver FWA. Because as you remember, 5G or FWA is one of the 5G use cases. And in fact, fixed wireless access is not only one of the 5G use cases, but it is the fastest growing fixed access technology. So fixed wireless access was growing last year by 23% compared to FTTH growing by 14%, and other stuff also growing at a far lesser rate. And it's clear why this is happening. Just like when mobile voice came in, of course, mobile voice growth exceeded fixed telephony very, very quickly, and became the dominant form of voice connectivity, especially in developing countries or Latin America, Africa, Asia, and so on. And so some forecast here with regards to the FWA growth from Ericsson. So this is really critical for, well, it is relevant for, of course, developed markets, because they have a rural connectivity deficit, including even the US, Europe, and so on. But it is absolutely essential for countries which have a less developed fixed infrastructure, because for broadband, they will rely on wireless just in the same way as they rely on wireless for voice and narrowband data. We are also seeing, of course, the end of copper. Those countries that have a reasonable copper network and that have people connected with DSL, we are now seeing that copper is being phased out. It has started in Europe and a number of other markets. Copper is being retired. And also copper is no good at delivering high data rates in rural areas, because the exchange tends to be too far away from the subscriber. So it's not terribly useful for higher data rate. So, and the cost of using FWA, 5G FWA, with large amount of spectrums, including the 6 gigahertz band, is 50 to 80% lower compared to connecting rural premises and fiber. And I must stress, I'm talking about rural. I'm not talking about urban, because in urban, no contest, fiber is definitely cheaper than fixed wireless access. In any event, the density is too high for wireless technology to compete. But when I talk about rural, we mustn't imagine sort of isolated farmhouses. Rural means, for example, small towns and villages in a rural area, perhaps with a population of 2,000 to 3,000, so 1,000 to households, perhaps, that sort of things. And these tend to be relatively clustered together and easily covered with one site. And that site is probably already there because there is mobile coverage, because most countries have mobile coverage obligations. I found some research done by the FTTH Council Europe quite useful. It shows you, as shown on these charts, how the cost per home passed differs depending on household density. So rural is down here. And as you can see, the cost per home passed, and then in addition to that, you have to connect the homes, is very, very high. So rural household probably costs you 2,000. And of course, at 2,000 euros, or call it dollars, let's not quibble, at that sort of price, it would require subsidies. So it's not really feasible at that price in rural. You have to bring down the cost if you want to bridge the urban-rural connectivity divide. And the business case, or the cost of providing connectivity, depends a great deal on the amount of spectrum that is available. So let's assume you have a cell tower already there because you provide mobile coverage. If you can deploy more spectrum on it, 1,000 or 2,000 extra megahertz, then that gets you a whole lot more of capacity to support higher data rates, in particularly 100 to 150 and even 300. We also tested 1 gigabit. If you want to deliver 1 gigabit to households, you can't really do that economically with fixed wireless access. Then fiber also becomes an option. But of course, the cost is enormous. And 1 gigahertz, frankly, in rural, that's out there. I think we're realistically, most targets are about the 100 megabits everywhere. For example, that's the goal in Europe. By 2025, the European Commission goal, 100% of homes should have available, if they want to, data speeds of 100 megabits in the downlink. Anyway, the more spectrum you have, the more users you can support per cell tower. So, as illustrated here, if you only rely on 400 megahertz of 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, you could support perhaps 220 households at 100 megabits. But the more spectrum you have, the more households you can support from a cell site. And that's, of course, crucial because affordability matters. So you run fiber to that cell site and pop all the spectrum on that cell site, and you can support 496 premises with a 100 megabit service. As you can see on this slide, you can, of course, support 220, but supporting a greater number of households is also relevant because the definition of what constitutes broadband changes. So in future, you might be able to, or you will be able to support slightly fewer households, but at greater speeds, 300 megabits. So it's another reason why adding the 6 gigahertz spectrum is important, because it does make FWA, 5G FWA in rural areas, it makes it into an economic, viable, and future-proof solution. Now, the thing is, in theory, you can build fiber everywhere, but this is not economically feasible. It's not economically feasible in developed countries like the US. They have to make a huge amount of subsidies available, same in Europe, but for sure it is not feasible in most of Latin America, Africa, or Asia. And so in most countries, broadband connectivity will be wireless. And at the end of Q4 2019, we had roughly 1.1 billion broadband connections, excluding mobile. So that's household connections, but that leaves 1.1 to 1.2 billion households without broadband access. And most of these are in developing countries or mid-income level countries. And a great deal of them are in fact in rural. So this is what we are talking about. And this is, of course, recognized by the Broadband Commission 2025 targets, which is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the target here, by 2025, entry-level broadband services should be made affordable in developing countries at less than 2% of monthly gross national income. So we have two things here. We have making it available to everyone. It needs to be broadband, and it needs to be affordable. And adding or having, as you could see, if I have the 6 gigahertz spectrum and IMT identification for that, so I can use it for 5G, that as part of a single network which both delivers mobile and fixed, that really drives down the cost and is key to delivering affordable broadband in emerging markets and particularly in rural areas. A key point, of course, is that the 6 gigahertz band can also be unlicensed. What does unlicensed mean? Unlicensed means essentially Wi-Fi. And the US has jumped the gun, as they do quite often. So they've not gone for an IMT identification, but the entire band is for unlicensed use. And that's absolutely fine. The US is different. It's a rich nation. There's lots of fiber around, lots of broadband around. Homes are by and large well connected. But let's ask ourselves whether the 6 gigahertz is best used for Wi-Fi or best used for 5G in the rest of the Americas, i.e. from the Mexican border downwards. Wi-Fi is, of course, an important connectivity tool, and we all use it, and that's great. But Wi-Fi only provides the last hop between the devices and the broadband access network. That's fine in Europe and America, where there is lots of fiber around. But if you haven't got any fiber to the home, what's the point of sticking a great big Wi-Fi capacity at the end of a very poor DSL connection, or where there is no connection at all? It doesn't make any sense. It does not solve the bottleneck, if you will. So in Latin America, the IMT identification for the 6 gigahertz will provide socioeconomic benefits, which would not be the case if the 6 gigahertz is used for Wi-Fi access. So the notion of using 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi to distribute traffic around a building is pointless, because the connectivity bottleneck in most places in Latin America is the connection to the network. And this is what the 6 gigahertz band could be used for, and that would maximize the socioeconomic benefit. And we can already see that 5G download speeds are faster than Wi-Fi connections. This is some data from OpenSignal here, measurements between January and April. And you can see, except in America, where Wi-Fi was in fact faster, in all of these other countries, UK, Spain, Australia, and so on, South Korea, the 5G speeds were in fact better than Wi-Fi speeds. Some people say, well, you know, we don't need that much mobile spectrum because people use Wi-Fi, so traffic is being offloaded to Wi-Fi. Yes, that used to be the case when data, when we had 3G rather than 4G or 4G, there wasn't enough 4G capacity, and this was referred to as Wi-Fi offload. But in fact, the fastest growing phenomena is Wi-Fi onload. So people are buying these little MiFi boxes or routers, which in fact have a connection, either an LTE connection or now a 5G connection to the network, and then distribute the signal around the home so that other devices can connect to it. So Wi-Fi onload is really the name of the game. And this is enabled by a combination of both 5G and additional spectrum in which 5G is deployed. So to summarize then, for most of the world's countries and most of the world's population, an IMT identification of the 6 GHz will deliver better socioeconomic benefits compared to the unlicensed use. So I'm not saying what they did in the US is bad or anything. It's appropriate for the United States. But what they're doing is not necessarily appropriate for other countries. And of course, we do know the US likes others to follow them, but it is ill-advised, I would say. So there are other things, of course. For enterprise, 5G can deliver something which Wi-Fi can't deliver. There is the high reliability, the capacity, the latency, the mobility. Basically, Wi-Fi cannot guarantee any mobility. Wi-Fi can't guarantee anything. And with network slicing and so on, particularly for enterprise and critical applications, 5G has an advantage over Wi-Fi. So I've got a little bit of extra time now just to address sharing with incumbents, because there is, of course, stuff going on in the 6 GHz band. The work on coexistence is underway, and the initial results are encouraging. So that's just as a sort of intro to that. The work is, of course, not finished, but it is encouraging. And since we're looking ahead to 2023, WRC 23, and then deployment in the 6 GHz band, beyond that, by that time, these issues will surely or highly likely to be resolved. So in summary then, the 6 GHz band, or an IMT identification for the 6 GHz band, is a good idea in developed countries with a good wired broadband connection to deliver the consistent 100 megabit user experience data rate in cities. That's great. It ensures that FWA is a long-term solution, and particularly it lowers the cost of FWA. And that's really, really, really critical for Latin America. And this is why I think this is so important to discuss this. And even if Latin America cannot deport or support to give an IMT or use IMT in the entire band, I think Latin American countries will benefit greatly from at least having an IMT identification of the 100 megahertz plus a further 600 megahertz, i.e. Supporting agenda item 1.2 and adopting that, because that will help to deliver the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So, as well as, of course, the ITU and UNESCO Broadband Commission 2025 targets. That brings me to the end of my presentation. And as I said, if you want to receive the full report, then please do send me an email and I'll send that out to you. That's in the public domain, so there's no cost associated with that. Right, I hope you found that interesting, and I apologize that I couldn't deliver this in Spanish. I don't speak Spanish for my sins. But I'm happy to take any questions. I understand there are translators, so if somebody wants to ask a question in Spanish, I believe I can get the translation. So over to you now. Any questions? Any questions for the audience? Please don't feel shy. It's always great to get some questions, queries, comments. A few weeks ago, I gave the same presentation for the equivalent conference in Africa, and a lot of African administration recognized that the 6 gigahertz band is essential for them to get broadband connectivity to most of their citizens, be it either mobile or FWA, because simply the fixed connectivity, there isn't enough fixed connectivity around, and would be way, way, way too expensive to build it. So, do we have any question? Nobody yet? I have a question here. Entry-level broadband. Well, the definition changes a little bit, but I think 30 megabits is now deemed to be entry-level. And when you look at most countries, what they now define as broadband, we really look at 100 megabits. If you think about it, you might think, oh, wow, 100 megabits, that's a lot. But places like Korea, they're already moving towards the gigabit society. So that's only 1/10 of what folks are doing in Korea. And I doubt that in rural DSL, you get 30 megabits. So I have another question here saying, so basically the 6 gigahertz band will not be the mainstream technology for Latin America 5G development. Well, that is a crucial point. That's a point I like to highlight in my paper. If there is an IMT identification for that 700 megahertz, then it will be or can be used for 5G and would be very useful. However, if this opportunity is lost, if Latin America simply follows the US, and I know there's a lot of lobbying going on, saying, you know, how wonderful that would be for Wi-Fi and so on. If Latin America simply follows the US instead of taking account of Latin America specific need, notably the lack of fiber, the lack of wired broadband access, then of course the 6 gigahertz can't be used for 5G, but I hope Latin America will make a decision according to its needs, and that at least 700 megahertz of the band will get an IMT identification from the Mexican border downwards, and so operators can use that both in the cities to serve the high user densities, places like Sao Paulo, Santiago de Chile, Mexico City, and so forth, as well as in rural for fixed wireless access. So it would be a mainstream technology. Here's another question. How about millimeter wave as a substitute, using millimeter wave instead? That is a very good question indeed. Now, and there was recently a lot of movement on that, and millimeter wave is great because there's a huge amount of spectrum available. You're talking about an excess of 800 megahertz per operator potentially, but the problem is that you can't really use it for wide area coverage. It doesn't penetrate, it doesn't do any of that. But let's look at FWA. Again, for FWA, the distances you can bridge with millimeter waves are potentially quite large, because let's remember, millimeter wave, the spectrum we are talking about, there's nothing new to that. Microwave can bridge large distances, but it is very directional, line of sight, subject to rain fade, foliage, and all sorts of things. So it can be used, and no doubt it will be used in certain cases. But if you have the typical rural town or something like that, it is way cheaper just to pop all the upper mid-band spectrum, so 3.3 to 7 gigahertz on an existing cell tower and radiate from that, and you cover the town. That is by far the cheaper solution. And of course, it does go through foliage and so on. Any last questions? I see here from Lula we have to wrap up, but so please do send me an email if you'd like to receive the report. I hope you found this interesting and that it does provide food for thought. So perhaps for Latin America, using the lower part of the 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed IE Wi-Fi is a good approach, and then the upper 700 megahertz for IMT. That combination would probably deliver the best outcome for Latin America. With that, I would like to thank you, and I will sign out.